committee here. So welcome everyone. This is the Production Issues panel. I am Amy Rowe with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. I work in Essex and Passaic counties and am a small farmer myself. So it is my pleasure to be moderating this Annie's Project Anniversary panel with you guys. And I will be introducing our speakers individually as we go through them. I'm just giving our supposed first speaker another minute or so. Dr. Joe Heckman should be joining us, but if not, we may be switching up the order. So please just have some flexibility. I appreciate your understanding. And if Joe doesn't come, we'll go to Lauren. And yeah, so thank you for understanding our whatever's happening here. Okay, Joe Heckman says he's trying to get into the production panel. So
I'm here now.
There he is. Hey.
Hi, Amy.
Okay, how are you? So now it is my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Joe Heckman. He is a professor in the Department of Soil Science, and he is also the extension specialist for soil science, and he works in soil fertility, organic crop production, and optimizing nutrition for plants, animals, and humans and their health. So please welcome Dr. Joe Heckman, and go ahead, Joe.
Okay, Amy, thank you for the introduction. Will I be doing the screen share, or is that something that you bring up?
You should be able to do that. You should have permission.
All right, let me go ahead and do that then.
Yeah.
Okay, can you now see my PowerPoint?
Yes. So if you
Okay.
could just put it into slideshow mode.
Will do.
Perfect.
If you go up to the top left corner, there's a little button that looks like a little screen with a triangle. It's right above the design button. One over.
That one?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, good.
There you go.
All right. So the title of my presentation is a key part of my presentation because I'm calling this community supported soil fertility, and it's about feeding the soils that feed us. So what I'm going to talk about is actually a very old idea, but I want to talk about it with this new word, community. And this is in the way here. So community supported agriculture has been around a long time, and it actually has roots that go back to Asia. So say it started in Japan, but then it was brought to the United States and popularized by Robin, a farmer in Massachusetts. So it really started in the United States around 1985, and community supported agriculture has become very, very popular. And so what I'm proposing is just think of supporting soil fertility in much the same way we do community supported agriculture, that it's almost like community supported agriculture in reverse. So there's an abundance of low cost natural waste materials, landscape trimmings, kitchen peelings, and food waste, even things like wood ash that come from plants. And they're all available for building soil fertility. The minerals that are in these waste materials are renewable when recycled. And in a lot of ways, you can think of them as being inexhaustible, because we know from physics that you cannot really destroy matter. And so an element is going to continue to be there. It's not something that's exhaustible as like burning petroleum. Any natural compostable substance that goes into a landfill, this is the way I look at it, is a lost opportunity to build soil fertility. There are strategies for beneficial use of these materials, and this includes composting or use as a mulch or as a fertilizer. So this just came out recently, and a new publication, and of course I can't see the title, but it's about managing food waste. And New Jersey recently passed a law that requires that food waste be recycled. And so I think that's a good thing. And this reminds me of a law that was passed in New Jersey in the late 1980s. And what it was about was that you could not put shade trees in the landfill anymore. They had to be recycled on the land. And so once again, these ideas go back a long ways. There was a book published called Farmers of 40 Centuries, and it really was about a sustainable agriculture. And they didn't use the word sustainable, they called it a permanent agriculture. And it was about the people in China, Japan, and Korea, and how they had like an inherited instinct to return all kinds of waste materials back to the land. And this book, Farmers of 40 Centuries, had a lot to do with inspiring the organic farming movement. And in the organic farming movement, one of their principles, a key principle, is something they call the law of return or the rule of return. And this is how you sustain soil fertility. And over at the Roto Institute, we have that long-term farming systems trial. It really does make a difference how you farm. If you farm with chemicals that don't contain organic matter, or you're using crop rotation and compost, you can change the soil in a very good way. You can improve the quality of the soil. That's the same soil there, but one is under organic management. I think you can figure out which one. So with every nutrient that is essential to plants, there's a nutrient cycle. This one here happens to be the nitrogen cycle. And when I teach soil fertility, I teach the nutrient cycle for every element. The nitrogen cycle is a very, very important one, and it flows through the atmosphere. Not every nutrient cycle does, but this one does. But still, you see that arrow going off to the bag of groceries, USDA organic, and then it goes into the compost pile and so on. That's a very critical aspect. And this is where the community supported soil fertility concept fits in. And there's one thing that's not here in this particular nutrient cycle, which is solar powered, and that is this. It doesn't include a synthetic nitrogen fertilizer factory, as shown here, the Haber-Bosch process. And now these corn plants here, you might say they're exhibiting nitrogen deficiency, but there's another way to look at it. You could say it's really a deficiency of the farming system, because with the right kind of farming system and with the recycling of waste back to the land, that this problem of nitrogen deficiency can be pretty much avoided. And that's what organic farmers do. And that's part of sustainability. And then here's another thing that I want to point out, that when we mine nutrients from the earth, in this case, this is rock phosphate being mined in North Carolina, it causes strip mining. But if we recycle the phosphorus that goes with our food to the city and bring that phosphorus back to the land, then we can recycle that phosphorus over and over again and minimize the need to do strip mining of land like you see there. And besides food waste and so on, there's abundance of yard waste. And I was talking about the how in New Jersey, they don't allow the use or placement of shade tree leaves into landfills, and that started in the 1980s. So when I started at Rutgers in 1990, we did a lot of research on the use of shade tree leaves as a soil amendment. And there's a lot of ways you can use them very beneficially. But one of the key aspects of using any type of waste material is to consider its composition or the ratio of carbon to nitrogen. And you see the list of different materials here. And it's like when you put it together a compost pile, you have to follow a pretty good recipe and have a good mix of things with low to high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So what happens if you take something like shade tree leaves and you add it to the soil? It robs the soil of nitrogen. The plants become nitrogen deficient. So you run into a depression in nitrogen availability. But then on the other hand, if you take something that's got a narrow carbon to nitrogen ratio, something like grass clippings, then you very quickly get an increase in nitrogen availability. So this is something to always keep in mind when you're using these materials. If you blend them together in a compost pile, it works very, very well because you can make a really nice compost. And this is a composting facility up in Sussex County called Ag Choice. And the pile heats up, it kills pathogens, kills weed seeds, and reduces the volume and makes a very, very nice soil amendment. So they're using a lot of yard waste, they're using kitchen waste, and so on. But one of the things to consider about compost, although it's very good as a soil amendment, it can be overdone. If it's applied in excessive amounts, it can cause an accumulation of too much phosphorus in the soil. So we don't always want to put on a lot of compost. Shade tree leaves, I want to talk more about that because I have a lot of research experience on it. And this is a program that has worked out very well. The only thing though, I want to point out here is that in the case of shade tree leaves, that the program in New Jersey was called municipal leaves. And I want to cross out that word and let's call it community, because there's a very different feeling about the word community. It comes with an association of fellowship and so on. And it's like you feel differently about community as you would something municipal, where it has a kind of a flavor of about government. So down in the lower corner here, you see the tomato plants where we took shade tree leaves, added it to the soil, and the tomato plants become nitrogen deficient. That's because of the very wide carbon to nitrogen ratio. So we've done a lot of work with different crops. This is about how we're going to use it for pumpkins as a mulch, put on a heavy layer and a 6-inch layer, then provides about 400 pounds of nitrogen, but only very slowly available. But the other thing I want to point out, another benefit of these shade tree leaves, it really protects the soil from erosion. There was a major rainfall event in this particular year, and you see where there's no mulch leaves applied, the soil's washing away. But the soil was able to soak in the rainfall when it fell on the mulched areas. It can cause nitrogen deficiency, but with the right crop rotation with legumes, you can avoid that. And so you see that here, the yellow pumpkin plants with the shade tree leaves, they look kind of yellow, but we've developed a strategy around that. Again, the right kind of crop rotation. But it has many other benefits too. So the pumpkins you see over on the left, that pile there, nice, big, clean pumpkins. That was a pretty good crop when the bare soil too. Not quite as big of fruits, but notice that they're muddy. And also, if you're going to run a pick your own operation, wouldn't you rather not get your shoes muddy? If you're walking on leaf mulch, it's a different kind of surface. And this persists all the way to the next spring. And you see the leaf litter there. I scratched it open there. And it really looks like a leaf litter in a forest. Very, very nice. And there you see the bare soil. So it does a lot to build soil quality. When we looked at crop rotation, it extended into the second and third growing season. We also did work with corn, and where we found that when we put the shade tree leaves on the soil, that it made the corn more drought tolerant. Over on the right without the shade tree leaves. Notice how the corn leaves are rolled up, exhibiting drought stress. Now, moving on to grass clippings, I won't have as much to say about, but my experience with it is that it also is a very good soil amendment, but it's quite different than shade tree leaves. They make a nice compost if you mix the greens and the browns together. That's an important principle of composting. But you can also use the grass clippings as a mulch. If you incorporate them into the soil, they can actually exhibit some toxic effect on crops. We've experienced that, but on the surface, they quickly, they also provide weed control, but they do release nutrients quickly, unlike shade tree leaves, but this has that really low carbon nitrogen ratio. And in here, in this particular case, I'm using it for sweet potatoes, very nice crop of sweet potatoes. So the next thing I want to just mention briefly is a bit more controversial. There's a group up in Vermont they called the Rich Earth Institute, and what they're working on is the collection and recycling of human urine. And so I did a little trial on my farm, and I collected my own urine and then applied it to right into this grass field, NPK. So it was a whole flush of growth there. And so this is what they're doing at the Rich Earth Institute in Vermont. And it's a very good, rich fertilizer in that the nutrients are readily available. So you can go to that website to learn more about it. And they have a whole community. They don't call it community supported necessarily, but I think it's good language to get people thinking in this direction. And they apply it to grain crops. And in this particular case, you can see they applied it to a hay crop. That's why there's a nice green strip there. So besides bringing the nutrients back from the urine, that it also saves a lot of water. If you're not flushing it down the toilet, then it saves a tremendous amount of water. So that's another advantage of it. And then to finish up, here's my last slide. And I will just go through the list of here, all the different things that this is about. So this community supported soil fertility, where we feed the soils that feeds us. It fosters fellowship and good feelings of helping their farmer and the soils that is producing their food. And it provides essential minerals that are recycled. And it's like they become an inexhaustible resource. We can use them over and over again if we keep in mind those nutrient cycles. So it offsets the need to produce synthetic fertilizers, and it reduces the need to strip mine for new minerals. It reduces energy consumption. As it turns out, if you look at the biggest energy consumer in agriculture, it happens to be the manufacture of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. There's benefits to soil health. It ends landfilling of these waste materials, and it can save a lot of water. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Thank you for that really interesting information about community-supported urine collection. But does anyone have any questions? I don't see anything in the chat, but since we have such a small group, you can just jump in, you can unmute and just ask Joe a question directly, or you can type it in the chat if you're feeling shy. But if there aren't any questions, we can move forward on our next speaker.
The one comment I should make about the urine, I don't think probably would not be permitted in organic farming. That's a big question that's been unsettled, because organic farming doesn't permit the use of sewage sludge, but then you could argue that urine is not sewage sludge. It never went to a sewage treatment plant. So, but anyway, and then I wouldn't recommend its use for vegetables. Use it on field crops.
Okay, I appreciate that. And Christina says, thank you, Joe. Great presentation. So we shall move on to our next speaker. Joe, if you could stop sharing your screen, please.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so now it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Lauren Erickson. She is a senior program administrator with Rutgers Cooperative Extension, working at coordinating the New Brunswick Community Farmers Market, as well as Rutgers Against Hunger. And she is also working on the Are You Ready to Farm, new beginner farmer training program that's been going on. It's been a very popular program. And prior to coming to Rutgers, Lauren co-owned and operated a diversified horse-powered vegetable farm in rural Maine, where she also co-founded a farmer's market and an agricultural cooperative. So she has lots of experience and we are excited to have her here. So please give your attention to Lauren.
Great, thank you, Amy. I'm glad to be here with everyone this evening. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And you will hopefully now see my PowerPoint with sustainable farm systems as our starting slide. So
Yes.
I am going, okay, great, thank you. I am going to be chatting about my time before Rutgers when I co-owned and operated Singing Nettle Farm in Maine. So just a little bit more about me. Big picture, my background started in environmental science and natural resources, and I kind of came to agriculture looking through the lens of potential food system solutions to reducing environmental impacts of food production. So I'm very excited to be chatting with you tonight about some of the sustainable practices that we had in place on our farm in Maine. I'm also now working on my doctoral degree in community nutrition. So I'm very interested in the nutritional implications of sustainable agriculture systems as well. So turning back the clock about 5 or 6 years to when I was farming in Maine, I'm going to be showing you a series of pictures from Singing Nettle Farm, which I operated with my husband, Bill Erickson. And this was our certified organic off-grid horse-powered farm. And you will see some pictures of the horses as we go through also. And we were growing many different crops that supported about 40 families through a CSA program. We founded and then attended a local farmers market during the growing season, and then also participated in the Maine Organic Farming and Gardening Association Common Ground Fair Farmers Market, which is a very large event every September. And then we had a few wholesale accounts selling some produce to local schools, a local restaurant, and a few other outlets. So I'm going to kind of start with our goals for the farm. And first and foremost, developing our farm system, we were very focused on creating a viable ecosystem. So it was important for us to be providing food for our community, but also to be developing a system that was regenerative to the land on which we were growing. We also did want to make a living. So we would always say, we needed to make enough money farming to be able to keep farming. So that was also part of what was important to us. So as we approach different systems in agricultural production, we're kind of balancing these goals of having an ecologically sound system that could also generate an income so that we could sustain the farm. So I used to end with this slide, but I'm going to start with the slide about self-sustainability, because I think it's really important to consider, as we're looking at our farms and production systems, to think about what's realistic for us. We do a lot of budgeting around inputs, both financial inputs and soil inputs and different materials and practices that we need. But I think we have to consider our personal budget also and think about what's going to sustain us so that, again, we can keep farming. So for us, our team, who I've listed there, was myself, my husband, Bill, Roka, Ruby, Riley, and Matt. Bill and I are the only humans on that list. The others were animals who were part of the system, who again, you'll see in some of these slides, but that it was important to us to be able to structure our system in a way that we could adequately manage it. So that meant keeping our CSA at a manageable size, only doing a reasonable amount of farmers markets for us. And this is going to be different for everyone. So depending on your farm and your system and your crew and your resources, this might be very small for some people, or it might be on a larger scale for some, depending on what you're looking for. So taking a big picture or broad lens look at our farm system, this photo is showing one section of our farm. One of the things we really thought about was our site planning and our layout so that we could maximize our use of the land with minimal input. And this meant taking into consideration things like certainly the soil quality in different parts of the farm and what we would be growing where, and soil maps were very helpful for that. Taking into account sun angles and wind patterns was important. Also thinking about where different crops were in relation to how much management they needed. So we had this section of the farm, which was right near our cabin that we built where we lived. And then we had another section of land through the woods that we were farming. That's probably about a half mile away. Now, a half mile is not particularly far, but it made a lot of sense for us to keep things that needed frequent attention, like the live animals, and also annual crops that needed frequent harvesting or things that needed frequent watering near us where we were living, so we could tend to them very easily. Things like potatoes, winter squash, crops that didn't need as much care tended to do really well in that field that was a little bit farther away because we couldn't and didn't have to get there as frequently. We also took into consideration, thinking again about sunlight, temperature, nutrients, and biomass, how to set up our farm to maximize these things on site. So what I'm showing you here is one of our unheated hoop houses, and we had on the north facing short end of this hoop house, live edge cedar paneling that we had harvested locally and had kind of closed off that side of the greenhouse, but the rest of it was optimized to maximum sunlight from the different exposure directions. We would water the crops in here, thinking about water conservation, with a drip irrigation system. So we had header pipes and drip lines that were planted or set up along the length of the beds that we had in the hoop house. And we would run through those drip lines, in addition to pure irrigation water, also some liquid nutrients. So we would do a lot with fish emulsion, for example. We had a liquid calcium blend that we could send through the drip lines. And the drip helped to maximize the efficiency of those nutrients by placing that liquid near the roots of the plants that were then going to uptake those nutrients. However, we also wanted to kind of maximize any potential leakage of those nutrients outside of our hoop house area. So what we did is, along the edges and the photo on the right, we planted a catch crop. So this is perennial comfrey that you can see on this side of the greenhouse. And what this would do is basically take up excess nutrients that may have been leaching out from near the greenhouse, accumulate those nutrients in the vast amount of biomass that this plant would produce. And then we were able to cut and harvest that comfrey and channel that into compost on site. So we were big fans of putting waste to work in various ways. So it's interesting, following Joe's talk about soil fertility, that was a big consideration for us and basically all things that we would do on the farm. So in addition to things like our comfrey catch crop, we were generating horse and chicken manure on the farm because we were working with our team of draft horses. So that's Matt and Riley that you see in the photo. And fun fact, they are pulling a John Deere manure spreader, a ground-driven spreader that was built in the 1930s. So pretty cool piece of equipment that we were able to use from one of our neighbors. So we would compost the horse manure, we would add leaves, grass clippings, other materials from the farm, non-diseased plant waste would go into the compost. We would include kitchen compost and at times had worm bins going for vermicompost. So basically generating as much nutrient as we could on the farm, recycling those nutrients, and then using the manure spreader to apply the finished compost into the fields where we would be growing a crop. We also tried to think about how we could overlap production systems. So we did not have a very large land base. but we did want to produce a diverse amount of crops and a lot of different things. So I like this series of photos because it kind of shows how we're putting some things together and some of the crops that we're generating from what turned into a primarily perennial system in this example. So we would basically, we were building raised beds along the contour of the land. So if you picture the land sloping downward, we would cut across that land with our beds so that the raised beds would almost act like a swaling or trellising system going down the hill to capture water runoff, which would in theory take with it nutrient runoff, and again, recycle that into the plants that we were growing. So you can see in the center photo, we're actually working with a team of college students who are helping us to mulch the young fruit trees that we had planted. There's some of that cut comfrey leaf in there as a nutrient addition, as well as wood chips that we had generated on site. And what we were growing here was, these were very young plum trees and other fruit trees. And then we had interplanted a crop of daffodil bulbs so that in the spring, we would have a cut flower harvest. We were doing early season bouquets. And then as the trees matured later in the year, we would have a fruit harvest. I also like including here that we have the horses pictured because growing in between the rows of the fruit trees was lush green grass that was able to serve as a food source for our horses. So the horses ate very little that came from off the farm. They would eat hay in the winter that came from a neighbor, but during the peak growing season, they could eat almost exclusively grass. So again, recycling those nutrients from the grass that was growing through the horses and the compost and back onto the produce fields. I also mentioned that we had chickens, and you can see them here working on cleaning out one of our hoop houses. So we would grow various types of early spring greens and usually a summer crop of tomatoes in our hoop houses. And as the tomatoes would come out, we would come in and seed a late season cover crop. So something like we would get oats or buckwheat down if we could, usually annual crops, but sometimes we would do it like a winter rye. And we would leave that crop in there, let it get a good amount of growth on it. And then you'll notice on the sides of the photo of this hoop house, that's snow that would build up over the course of the winter in Maine, as you might imagine. So when there was nothing really for the chickens to forage outside when the ground was snow covered, they would move into the hoop houses and they could eat the cover crop that had been growing. They did their own fertilizing of the greenhouse, and then they could also scratch around in the soil for any insects or larvae that might be overwintering. So we put them to work. They were happy and warm, and then we would just get them out of the hoop house and back into their designated chicken area with enough time to let the soil sit before we planted another crop in there. So they're kind of part of our rotational system. We also tried to do as much integrated planting, both with some annuals and also perennials around the farm system. So thinking about plants that would attract pollinating insects, one for the benefit of having the pollinators in and of themselves, but also because they would then help with pollinating the annual vegetable crops that we were growing on site. But this integrated planting also provided habitat both during the season and also over the winter for beneficial insects to overwinter. We also tried to use renewable resources around the farm in general when we could. So we were farming in a few fields surrounded by hundreds of acres of woods that we had access to. So we would harvest trees from the forest for things like mushroom cultivation. So those are some shiitake mushrooms that you see in the center there. We harvested our firewood from the woods on the property. And then usually about once a year, we would rent a wood chipper that we would bring to the farm, and we would chip all of the brush that we had been collecting over the course of the season. And then that wood chip material would serve as mulch, primarily for our perennial beds of tree production and other things around the farm. And that's my buddy Riley there helping me to pull one of the logs out of the woods. So as we were doing this, we also had these edge areas. So near, kind of beyond the border of our annual production beds, but not quite in the woods. And so what we started to do was to develop the agroecosystem with additional perennial agricultural crops. So including things like hazelnuts, blackberries, blueberries, and other woody plants in the area to round out our potential harvests, into the future as these perennials started to bear, but also to, again, kind of keep the ecosystem healthy with large crop diversity on site. So my kind of penultimate slide here is about enjoying the yield and maximizing profits of many kinds. So, I mentioned at the start, we needed to make enough money farming to keep farming. So that was a goal, but we also took pride in growing nutritious food for the community. So again, thinking about the products coming out of the farm, certainly, diverse fruits and vegetables were great. Getting that nutrition into our community, we really believed has long-term health implications for the people who are eating the food. We also, by having these pollinator plantings, we're contributing to ecosystem health and habitat over time. And then through our nutrient cycling on the farm, really building that soil fertility over time as well. And all of these things kind of came together, as we would share what we did with the community, we were able to really take pride in what we were doing and what we could share, and had a good story to tell to our customers as well, in terms of marketing, but also so that they could be really proud of the food that they were eating. So I will say thank you, and I will stop there and take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. That was amazing. Everything that you did is really impressive, and farming isn't hard enough, but then you had to do it off the grid, and that just is really amazing to me. Yeah, so Christina says, thank you. That was impressive. And if anyone has any questions, we are a small group, so you can go ahead and speak up.
Hi, Lauren. I have a question. Great presentation. I was wondering if, because you mentioned that you had like hundreds of acres of forest, and I was wondering if you had any problems with like pests or like deer, and if you had to do any prevention or resistance with that.
That's a great question. The short answer is yes, yes, and yes. So deer, there was a large deer population where we were farming. But the good news was they had hundreds of acres, they had a lot of space. So it actually, I think some of our New Jersey farms even have worse deer pressure than we experienced because of space constrictions. But we did put up deer fencing. We were usually able to get away with double-stranded electric fence because deer don't like to jump across wide ranges. So we would do a single strand of electric fence at about 3.5 feet high. And then beyond that, a double strand at about maybe 18 inches and 6 feet. And then that span would deter deer pretty well. It's not foolproof, but pretty well. And then we also had a German Shepherd. And so to this day, we're no longer farming, but she knows the word deer and she knows the word rabbit. And if she hears me say that, she will run to the door barking, like she knows she has to go chase away the rabbit and come back. So that also helped for sure. And then there were porcupines, but that's a whole nother discussion.
Lauren, what became of your farm after you've left Maine? Did you transition it to someone else?
We did. So we actually leased the land where we were farming. So the original, or the owners who we leased from, maintained ownership of the land, and we transferred the lease to another couple who are, they since left and transferred it, but now there is a secondary couple who has taken it over, and they've been there for a few years now and are doing quite well. So it's nice to see that it's still used. And similarly used, I should also add. They're also certified organic and doing a lot of, not farming with horses, but they have a lot of similar, I think, conservation practices in place, which is nice to see.
I like how you integrated many different systems together. That was nice to see.
Thank you. It kept us busy, but we enjoyed it.
I'm sure it does. Yeah, when you don't specialize, there's so many different things that need to be done. And at the same time, I know, like, I have a farm, and when I leave the house in the morning and look around, I can see like 10 jobs, and which one do I do first?
Mm-hmm. But it does keep it interesting, and it, let us use a lot of different skills, that we had developed over the years, and to learn a lot of new skills by taking a lot of this on.
Yeah, sounds like great experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's a lot of benefits to diversifying. So that's great. Okay, well, we are right on schedule. So thank you again, Lauren. And let's move on to our last but not least speaker for this panel. So Dr. AJ Both. He is in the, he's a Rutgers Cooperative Extension Specialist in Controlled Environment Engineering, or greenhouses and things like that. And he's housed in the Department of Environmental Sciences, which is near and dear to my heart. And his research focuses on methods and systems to provide the optimum growing environment in protected plant production facilities. He also has expertise in hydroponics, lighting, and the use of energy in agricultural systems. So please welcome AJ.
Thank you. I'll try to share my screen. Can you see the full screen now?
Yes.
Yep, there it goes. Great,
Okay.
thank you.
So the topic that I picked, or was assigned, however you want to look at it, is focusing on sustainability, crop production, soils, and energy. And when I thought about that, how can I combine those three components, I came to agrivoltaics. And I'd like to give you a little presentation about what agrivoltaics is and why I think that it might be an opportunity for beginning farmers or farmers that have not been in business very long as an opportunity to run their operation. So this, key farming characteristics. Farming is risky. We have to deal with things like weather, fluctuating prices, marketing, and small margins. That's all challenging. It requires many skills, as you just heard. It's a lot of hard work, as was also pointed out, and it has an impact on the environment. And that impact can be good or bad, depending on how you farm and what kind of practices you follow. But also, and this is why a lot of farmers are still doing it, it can be very rewarding. You can be your own boss, you can work outdoors a lot, you can help feed people, as Lauren just explained. So that could be very attractive. One way to reduce the risk involved in farming is to try to diversify, and we just heard about that and saw great examples of that. So the example I wanted to address today is agrivoltaics. And agrivoltaics combines agriculture with photovoltaic systems, solar panels. And it's not like solar farms that you may think of first when you think about what we do in New Jersey. But we'd like to try to keep the land in agricultural production. And this is not the case when you look at traditional solar farms. And I'll have an example of that coming up. So what we have to do in order to combine these two activities is we have to raise the panels or tilt them in a certain way to make agriculture possible, while at the same time getting the benefit of generating electricity. So obviously, when you try to combine these two systems, some yield reduction is anticipated because you very likely will have less light getting to the crop. But there will be income that you can receive from the generated electricity. So the goal of this whole activity is to have a system where the sums of the two components, agriculture and photovoltaics, will deliver more income than either one of them could by itself. An added benefit of doing this is that we can contribute to the state's mandate of producing a very large amount of renewable energy in an attempt to try to reduce the impact on the climate and to reduce global warming. And the other tip that I want to give you is that the university has a team that is currently working on designing and building several agrivoltaic systems. So the take-home message here is that if you wanted to try this, you're not alone. You can reach out to the university and try to get in touch with the group that is currently working on this practice. So some examples. Here's a typical solar farm that you probably thought of first when I mentioned solar farms. But if you look at this picture, you can clearly see that this particular setup is only focusing on electricity generation and is basically removing the land from agriculture. So this is not what we have in mind when we talk about agrivoltaics, or sometimes it's called dual use agriculture. There are some intermediate approaches that you can think of. So here again is a solar farm. It's close to the ground, so the land underneath the panels is probably lost to farming, but the land between the panels can still be used to grow flowers. And of course, when you do that, you can also have bees, and so you create a pollinator habitat that could become a source of income. And I'll have a few more things to say about it in a second. The other thing that is often associated with these low to the ground solar systems are grazing animals, and particularly sheep. Sheep are very good at keeping the grass short, which helps to maintain a good environment for the panels so that the vegetation is not shading the panels. And again, because the panels are relatively low and the sheep are not very tall, that seems to be a good mix. But this is not what we typically think of when we think about agrivoltaics. We want to maintain more agriculture, more traditional agriculture than just grazing sheep or having a pollinator habitat. So here you see the beginnings of that idea. We raise the panels and now we can graze bigger animals like cows or even horses underneath these systems. Or in the next slide, you can see you can grow vegetables underneath them. So clearly you need a fairly beefy structure to raise these panels. And you can also see that there's some space between the panels to allow some more light to get to the crop. So it's not, the light is not totally blocked, because obviously we want to do two things at the same time. We want to grow a crop that needs light, but we also want to use some light to generate electricity. These panels are what we call fixed tilt panels. So they are mounted at an angle facing south, and the tilt angle of the panels is fixed. So they're always oriented in the same direction. We can also do that differently, as you see in the next slide. Here, panels of 6 individual modules are combined and mounted on a rotating post. And so these rows are oriented north-south. In the morning, the panels are tilted towards the east. And then as the day progresses and the sun changes position in the sky, these panels rotate so that at the end of the day, these groups of panels are facing south. And we do that because by rotating the panels, we can get more electricity generation from the panels. So we call these a single axis tracking system. And as you can see, you can put these over fairly large expanses of agricultural fields, and the space taken up at ground level by the support system is pretty minimal. So you still have lots of space available to do your traditional agricultural cropping system. Some of these systems are built very tall, as you can see in this image, tall enough to run a combine underneath. But clearly, when you go to that height and you need to support that amount of weight, you need a pretty beefy structure. So there is additional cost involved in designing and operating such a system. We can also put these panels vertically. Again, these rows are oriented north-south, and these systems are designed to have maximum light interception early in the morning and later in the afternoon. And these are particularly suitable for animal grazing operations, or as you can see in this image, for growing hay. So the system is designed so that the width of the equipment matches the spacing between the rows, and that makes for a fairly efficient system. So the opportunities that I see for new or beginning farmers are, first, you can look at the traditional solar farms and try to partner with landowners or solar developers that have those traditional solar farms and operate, as I showed you, beehives or maybe graze animals. Sheep are the typical species that is used, but you can also think about chickens or perhaps goats, as long as the goats are not able to climb on the panels. As you know, goats like to climb on things, and I don't think it's a good idea to have goats walking on the solar system. But you can also, if you are so inclined to start your own farm, use these raised systems and combine your agricultural production with the photovoltaic system. So you can graze, as I showed you, cows or horses, if the panels are raised high enough to allow those animals to walk underneath them. You can also grow hay or grow forage for hay using these vertically mounted bifacial panels that I showed you. I showed you examples of growing vegetables, and then there is a variety of specialty crops, especially fruiting crops like raspberries, blueberries, and strawberries, and cranberries that can be grown underneath these panels. And I'll show you an example in this slide. Here you see a trellised raspberry production system with a roof-like structure that includes solar voltaic cells. If you look at the panels carefully, you see that not all the structure is covered with solar cells. Some of it is transparent to allow light to pass, but then you see the black strips. Those are the solar cells that generate electricity. And this is particularly suitable for a crop like raspberries that are prone to have issues with precipitation. So a structure like this can really help keep that crop at peak production conditions, and at the same time also generate electricity from this production system. We can also use a system like this over grapes. You see an example of how that might work. Again, this is a pretty beefy structure, so there will be more expense involved in a facility like this. So in conclusion, I pointed out, and you know already, that farming has uncertainty or risk involved. That's inevitable, but that risk can be managed. We can institute various protocols. You can get trained to address risk. You can maybe buy some insurance to cover some of the risk, or to cover some of the effects of risk. We can minimizing the risk can be expensive. We can try to bring our crops indoors in greenhouses, or if you want to go even a step higher or a step further, you can go to indoor farming. But those are very expensive production facilities, so that may not be an option for a beginner farmer. Financial diversification or spreading your risk is a very good tactic, and Lauren gave good examples of how you could do that. So spreading risk by continuing your agricultural operation, but also having a way to, from the same land, generate electricity may be another way of spreading your risk and making sure that you can sustain your farm. So agrivoltaics, I think, can be a good fit. It maintains the land in agriculture production, which is something that for us who work in agriculture feel is very important. It should not negatively impact the soil health, although we're going to do some studies on that, and we're going to try to verify that, but there is initially no indication that there should be significant impact on soil health. It adds a steady income from the electricity generation. That can be, again, thinking about risk, a very good a contribution to the farming operation. And of course, it contributes to New Jersey's energy mandate that says that we have to have a significant amount of our electricity produced from renewables. So not only do you help your farm, but also do you contribute to New Jersey's mandate that says we need more renewable energy production in the state. So with that, I'd like to close. This is a picture of red currants. It's a flashback to my youth. This was a very favorite summer treat that we got that as kids we loved because you ate it with lots of sugar, and you know, kids like sugar. So with that, I'd like to close, and I wonder if there's any questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, AJ. That was very informative. Again, since we're a small group, go ahead and ask AJ questions directly if you have any questions or comments.
Well, AJ, I thought that was very interesting. I was aware of grazing sheep under solar panels, but I wasn't aware that there was all these other opportunities for integrating them with agriculture. My question is about how does the efficiency of the panels change over a period of years?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is some literature on the degradation and the reduction in efficiency, but the newer panels are designed to last 20 to 25 years. And over that time period, the reduction in efficiency is pretty minimal. So the current panels that are available are pretty darn good and should last a 20, 25-year time span without too much reduction in efficiency.
And the structure would still be there if you needed to replace the panels. You could replace the panels and use the existing structure, right?
Correct, yes.
Okay, so Candace says there are lots of shade-loving perennial flowers and shrubs that could also be grown under solar panels, and she would love to be a test case. So I don't know, AJ, if you have someone to connect her to at Rutgers, or
Yeah,
if
she
you
can
know.
connect with me, and I'd be happy to talk to her. As I said, there's a group in the process of designing these systems, and we hope to have them in production in the next year or so. So hopefully by next spring, or maybe a little bit later in the summertime, we will have some space where we can do some experimentation, or we can work with Candace to try to do something at her property if she wants to.
Thank you.
That's great. Good outcomes from this panel, so thank you.
Can I ask another question? AJ, I've wondered about, like, around exit 8, the turnpike, there's these huge warehouses. New Jersey has these humongous, they take up like lots of farmland. Why couldn't we put solar panels on the roofs of those warehouses?
We can. The issue is that if you combined all the roof surface area in New Jersey available, including residential homes and businesses, all that area would still not be enough, would actually be a drop in the bucket when you look at the energy mandate that the state has set for itself. So we need to look at other properties too, and that includes very likely farmland. And what solar developers are doing currently is they try to convince farmers to let them use that land for solar farms, but that takes that land out of agricultural production. And this is what we want to try to prevent. We want to try to figure out a way to keep that land in agricultural production and at the same time contribute to the state's mandate for more renewable energy.
But if I heard you correctly, what you're saying is that there really isn't any reason why the panels can't be put on top of a warehouse roof, right?
Yeah, of course, you're going to add some weight. So the warehouse roof has to be designed strong enough to carry that weight. But other than that, there's no reason why there shouldn't be any panels on those roofs. And I think it would be good for the state to look into mandating, if they give permits for those structures to be built, then they should also be adding solar panels just to contribute to our renewable energy mandate.
So AJ, you're saying that if every roof in New Jersey had solar panels on it, it wouldn't be enough to reach the renewable energy mandate that the state set forth?
Correct.
Wow.
Well, on the other hand, I mean, they're talking about building a lot of wind farms off the Jersey Shore too. So that would be another contributing factor.
That's right. And that's also going to help. The wind farms that we are planning currently are going to be a significant contribution to our electricity consumption. But again, what is planned currently is nowhere near enough to cover the total mandate. We want to have, I think, 100% renewable energy by 2050. And that just requires a massive investment and a massive expansion of the renewable energy sources that we have currently, both on land and offshore.
AJ, one of the things that renewable or solar and wind get criticized for is that it doesn't provide a steady supply. With solar, I mean, you don't have a nighttime generation. And then how is energy storage technology coming along?
Storage technology is coming along pretty well, but we will be relying, I think, on our nuclear power as a backup system or as a contributing energy source for our overall power consumption in the state of New Jersey. It's not possible, I think, to completely switch all of our power to renewables.
So we have about a minute left, and then we will all be moved into the main session. So if you have any extra comments, go ahead and say your piece. Otherwise, we'll be leaving here soon, but I want to thank our speakers again for a very nice, productive panel. And you should have everyone's contact info if you need to talk to anyone. But thank you for coming to this panel, and we'll see you back in the main session.
I want to ask AJ one more quick question. What about burning